Well, greetings and welcome today to Reclaiming the Space Between Doubt and Dogmatism with Dr. Josh McNall. Today's event is part of the Wesley Seminary Webinar Series with the goal of resourcing the local church. So we are thrilled that you have joined us today. Thank you so much for making time in your day to join this presentation. Today's event is sponsored by Wesley Seminary. So if you're thinking about starting your MA, your MDiv, or your DMin, this is a great time to get that process started. We would love to talk to you at 877-673-0009. Cammie, Shannon, Alex, or Diane would love to chat with you and answer any questions that you have. Again, 877-673-0009, or just email us at wesley@endwest.edu. Now, during today's presentation, should you have any questions, please submit those in the Q&A forum at the bottom of the screen, and Dr. McNall will answer as many of those as time allows today after his presentation. Now, with us today is Dr. Josh McNall. Thrilled to have you with us, Dr. McNall. Dr. Josh is the Associate Professor of Pastoral Theology at Oklahoma Wesleyan University, where he has been since 2009. Dr. McNall holds a PhD in theology from the University of Manchester, an MA in theology from Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, and a BA in pastoral ministry from Oklahoma Wesleyan University. Now, Josh, believe it or not, if he has any free time, he also spends it directing the honors program and is the ambassador for church relations at Oklahoma Wesleyan University. Dr. Josh also has a blog at joshuamcnall.com, and he hosts the Outpost Theology podcast. Now, Josh and his wife are both graduates of Oklahoma Wesleyan University, and they have 4 children. Now, Josh, I don't know how you have any free time on top of all of that as an author, a preacher, a teacher, but I also understand that you are a golfer, that you enjoy CrossFit with your friends, and I hear that you are an excellent worship leader. Although I hear that you're very humble about that, but I hear you're great. And also a bit of a culinary expert. So you're a man of many talents. Well, Dr. Josh, we're thrilled to have you with us today. Thanks for taking the time to share with us. Look forward to hearing what you've got to share. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Joel. I really appreciate you having me on to talk to everybody. Now, just because I'm new, will I see everybody, or is it just going to be, will I just see the Wesley?
No, you will not see, no, you won't see anybody, but they can submit questions in the Q&A forum at the bottom.
I'll try to not become sort of narcissistically infatuated with my own image there. It won't be too difficult, I don't think. So that was a very kind introduction. And even though I can't see you, I want to say thank you to everybody who's tuning in, both live and also for those who are watching this in the recorded version. The subtitle or the title of the discussion is actually the subtitle for my most recent book. And I've got that with me here in case I forget any of the things that I wrote. But the title is Perhaps, and the subtitle is Reclaiming the Space Between Doubt and Dogmatism. And so when Joel asked me to come on and talk about something, that's the most recent book that I've put out, and it's through IVP Academic. And so it is really trying to bridge the gap, in some ways, the same gap that Wesley Sim is trying to bridge, and that is between the academy and the local church. It's not just for professors. It's also not just for pastors, though. It's dealing with theology and kind of big questions that people are wrestling with, both in the pew and in the pulpit and in our colleges and our universities and our seminaries. And so I'm thankful for the chance to talk about that. I think the place to begin, and I'm just going to speak to you, I'm not going to have a lot of slides. I'm going to try to just kind of do it more as a conversation. The place I want to begin is why I wrote the book and talk about who it's for. In short, I wrote the book because I was noticing a trend that many sociologists, many pastors, many people who are just kind of attuned to the culture in which we live in have been aware of, and that is that there's an increasing population of what we sometimes call the spiritually homeless. folks who, we use different terminology like the rise of the nuns, people who maybe formerly connected with a particular tradition, religious tradition, Christianity or what have you, but now kind of consider themselves adrift, spiritually speaking. Many of those people are, some of them are former students of mine, people that I love dearly and have gone through seasons of intense doubt, or the kind of buzzword that we throw around, or that gets thrown around a lot, is this word deconstruction, which often is used outside of its original academic meaning to just mean people who are questioning their faith. And I wrote this book to try to speak to people who are going through seasons like that, but also pastors and leaders and professors who are trying to lead well in the midst of this moment in our culture. A lot of that deconstruction, or a lot of that doubt, stems from questions or conflict that have to do with science in some cases, have to do with sexuality in a lot of cases, and thirdly, have to do with politics and the increased division in the United States, especially people who feel sort of spiritually and politically homeless as well. And then the third reason that I wrote the book was that in many cases, this realm of apologetics, and in some ways the book is trying to provide an apologetics for Christian orthodoxy. But apologetics, I think, has been heavily dominated by a kind of rationalistic style of discourse. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it does only speak to sort of one side of our brains in many cases. And I wanted to explore, what is the place of the imagination? What is the place of art and even, inspired works of fiction in drawing people toward the truth of Scripture and the beauty of Christian faith, and specifically the beauty of orthodoxy? And so what's the place for the imagination, for art, even for literature, as we are awakened to transcendence in what is increasingly a post-Christian culture? And so the book opens, for maybe a few of you, maybe one or two of you that have read it, with a reference to Joseph Conrad's book, The Heart of Darkness, and Joseph Conrad's book dealing with kind of colonial Africa and racism and the incursion of certain Western powers into Africa. And it opens with this narrator, Marlowe, placing his finger on a map. And he said, "I was always drawn to the blank spaces on the map." And I use that story to say that this is a book that tries to sort of stretch out into the blank spaces on our theological maps, where we have questions about God and about Scripture and how to interpret it. And so the title of the book is stolen from a quote with attribution from Tom Wright in his big book on the Apostle Paul. And N.T. Wright, in Paul and the Faithfulness of God, he's actually talking about Philemon and Paul's words to Philemon in that New Testament letter. And Wright makes this observation. He says, sometimes believing in providence means learning how to say perhaps. And he's referencing a passage in Philemon where Paul says, essentially, maybe the reason, he was taken from you was this. He's supposing, he doesn't know. And Paul Wright says that even for apostles, moments of unambiguous clarity about what God is doing in the world, or maybe the reasons behind what he is doing, that unambiguous certainty were often absent even for people like Paul. And so to trust in God's hand over history and in our lives sometimes means learning that little word, perhaps. And I thought that was a fascinating quote when I read it years ago, because that word perhaps is something very different than a claim to certitude. We sometimes can make claims to certitude about things that are just logically obvious, logical syllogisms, or like how many chairs are in this room, we can just count and be certain. But in questions of faith, that kind of mathematical or logical certitude is often absent. And so we have to be open to what is sometimes referred to as God's other name, and that is surprise. And so even Paul had to learn that word. And so that's the origin of the title of the book. And I'm looking at theologically, what's the place of speculation in theology? That's maybe on a little bit more of the academic side of the book and the audience. But for those who study theology, to call someone's work, quote, speculative is almost never a compliment. It's a shame word in theology. But one of the ideas I'm exploring in this book is that, is there actually a good use of speculation, theological speculation, not in the attempt to just engage in trivialities, debates about how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, but as one who is reaching forward from a place of questions or even a place of doubt to try to land on a place of Christian faith, and a historic orthodox understanding of Christian faith in the midst of a culture that is increasingly post-Christian. So that is just by way of introduction, why I wrote the book, who it's for, and a little bit about the title. So I'm going to essentially walk through this in the basic 4 parts of the book. I have a few notes here, and I hope that as you're listening to this, you think of questions and you can chime in on the questions time at the end. For the first part of the book, the Irish poet W.B. Yeats has a famous poem, The Second Coming, and he says in that poem, "Things fall apart, the center cannot hold." And for those of us who look across the landscape of our culture, I think that seems almost self-evidently true, that the center cannot hold. We're in a time of increased polarization, in division, left versus right, millennial versus boomer, young versus old, Black versus white, college educated versus non-college educated. And there's this sense that Yeats was right, that the center cannot hold. And we talk about those divisions, right versus left and old versus young. But the 2 extremes that I'm looking at in this book, I identify on the one hand as the land of doubt, and on the other hand, the land of dogmatism, doubt versus dogmatism. And just as many of us have a sense that our culture is increasingly terrorized by the fringes, so to speak, the extreme voices on either side of any issue that seem to sort of suck up all the oxygen in the room sometimes. They get all the algorithmic boosts on social media because of the sort of extremity or the volume of their voices. I've noticed that an increasing number of Christians or former Christians seem pulled toward one of these 2 extremes, the land of doubt or the land of dogmatism. And so what I'm asking in the book is how it might be possible to claim this sort of sacred middle ground that we could call just the realm of faith. I love that word. But what I'm calling in this book, the region of perhaps, on certain questions in our faith that are just simply hard to answer. And I'm not talking about, do we believe that Jesus is the Son of God or not? Perhaps. That's not what I mean by that word. But what I mean by it is a willingness to allow our imaginations to be reawakened by the gospel, even in the absence of a kind of mathematical certitude on certain questions in the faith. So as I said, what's the place of speculation in theology? What's the place of art and poetry and literature in this sacred middle ground between the land of doubt and the land of dogmatism? That's essentially an introduction. And what I'd like to do next is to talk about those 2 regions, that land of doubt and dogmatism, and define what I mean by them, and hopefully make some observations that would be helpful for the church as well as to those who work in the academy. So I want to start with what I'm calling the land of dogmatism. And when I say that, I want to be clear that I'm not talking about dogma in the classical theological sense, that as Christians, there are certain dogmas that, we might say the Trinity, the full deity and humanity of Christ. I mean, these are certain bedrock doctrines that we would even say are so essential that they're dogmas of our faith. And so when I talk about dogmatism, I am not critiquing or attempting to get rid of those dogmas. That's not what I mean by the term dogmatism. What I mean by it is increasingly something that I've noticed in our culture, in our social media especially, but even in my own heart and in the hearts of those who I preach to and those who I am, rubbing elbows with. When I say dogmatism, I'm talking about a matter of tone and then a matter of emphasis. So the tone in which we communicate, and then what we emphasize as most important. And so the first part in my definition of dogmatism, this extreme that seemingly more and more people are being pulled into in our culture, I talk about as a shrillness of tone, or as I think I call the title in the book, survival of the shrillest, to use sort of Darwinian lingo instead of survival of the fittest, but survival of the shrillest. And I've noticed this increasingly because of what I would call the algorithmic takeover of the modern mind, that we've created these algorithms that often prioritize outrage. And then, just like the Israelites and the golden calf, we make these images or these things, and then we ourselves are shaped or warped by them, so that we are kind of like conformed to their image. Marshall McLuhan, the famous kind of media theorist, is often credited, actually quite somewhat wrongly, with this quote, but it is based on his work, that first we shape our tools, and then our tools shape us. And that's certainly true, I think, when it comes to the shrillness of our discourse in this day and age, driven in many cases by algorithms and other factors. So when I talk about the slide toward dogmatism, that's the first part of the definition, is it's a kind of shrillness of tone that I think I'm watching it sort of drive many, especially young people, bright, thoughtful young people, away from the faith, this kind of shrill dogmatism. And one of my favorite quotes, every chapter starts with an epigraph. Most of them are from fiction. I love reading. I love, fiction as well as theology. And there's a quote from Miss Maudie in To Kill a Mockingbird, where she says, "Sometimes the Bible in the hand of one man is worse than a whiskey bottle in the hand of another." And I love the Bible. I believe the Bible. I'm not questioning it at all. But we've all seen ways in which any book can become a projectile. And so dogmatism, the first part of that definition, is that it's often characterized by a kind of anger or a shrillness of tone. And then the second part of it, I talk about as an attitude of kind of unfounded certitude. So if the first part is shrillness, then the second part has to do with a pretending towards certainty, even on matters that maybe we ought to hold a little bit more loosely, questions that we ought to be a little bit more just honest about with regard to some of our doubts and our questions and the things we just don't know. Faith, and those who are biblical scholars are well aware of this, pistis, that Greek word for faith, or it's often translated as belief or trust or fidelity, or I like the translation allegiance or believing allegiance, is not the same as mathematical certitude. It's not the same as certainty. But sometimes when we live in a fraught moment, when we feel our faith is being questioned, or we feel that we're losing an argument, the temptation is to be a little bit like the preacher. This is a preacher story, I don't know if it's true, who supposedly wrote in the margin of his or her sermon, quote, "Point is weak, comma, yell louder." And it seems that that's a temptation, I would say, not even just for those people out there, but it's a temptation I've recognized in my own heart to slide towards dogmatism when I feel like maybe I'm losing an argument, or when I feel like people are not seeing the world in the same way that I'm seeing it in. And so that's the first extreme that the book deals with, the slide towards dogmatism. And one of the things I do in that, it's really a series of 3 chapters. One of the things I do there is talk about what's the difference between a truly prophetic imagination or a prophetic mode of discourse, and what I'm talking about is just a kind of shrill, angry dogmatism. Oftentimes when things get heated, and I'm not really on social media, there's a variety of reasons for that, but when things get heated on social media or in the culture wars or whatever, the excuse that's often given is, well, I'm being prophetic. And sometimes I think that's maybe true. Jesus says some harsh things. Jesus says some hard things. And Jesus isn't always just this sort of, weak, sort of laissez-faire person. But other times I think, no, you're not being prophetic, you're just being rude. And so what's the difference between a genuinely prophetic stance, and we as Wesleyans know, deep embedded in our DNA is a history of being willing to speak up boldly on things, even when it's not popular in the culture, on things like abolitionism, especially in the South in our history, or on things like the fact that God calls men and women into leadership in the church, and speaking up on things like the sanctity of life. And I think that's important, and that's good, and that ought to be championed. But what's the difference between prophetic speech and dogmatism? And one of the things I worked with Walter Brueggemann, the Old Testament scholar, in this chapter, and I don't agree with Brueggemann on several things, actually. But his book, The Prophetic Imagination, I think is helpful in highlighting this trait in the prophets. And that is really 2 traits. That prophetic speech, when it gets away from lament, it turns very quickly into shrill, angry dogmatism. And so one posture that's important for us who care deeply about some of the things that are wrong in our world and in our church is to reclaim the discipline of lament that is different than just yelling at people and things. And so weeping and lament is part of it. But the other side is an openness to joy, and to celebrate the good things that are there, and that the prophets at once were both weeping and dancing. And I talk about the story of Desmond Tutu in apartheid South Africa, when the soldiers come into the church and they begin to break up this gathering, and how the worshipers there in South Africa began to dance and to sing. And as Tutu approaches the secret police or the soldiers, he says, you don't realize you've already lost. Come and join us on the winning side, on the side of justice and peace and reconciliation. And that's a posture that is incredibly strange, because it marries together joy and exuberant hope in the God of Israel, the God of resurrection, the God of new beginnings, the God of holiness and sanctification, with a willingness to weep and lament the things that are wrong in our world. And both of those postures stand in contrast to a kind of just sort of shrill dogmatism that we can identify in different places. And so the first land that I'm trying to work against is just that, the land of dogmatism. And while I'm doing that, I want to also say that even if we can't have a sort of mathematical certainty on some questions of faith, that doesn't mean that we can't have a sort of spirit-birthed assurance. And I like that word, assurance. It's the kind of word that Wesley, it's the kind of concept that Wesley received, at Aldersgate or post-Aldersgate. It might not be a visible hand writing your name on the wall in some sort of Old Testament fashion, but it's a spirit-birthed assurance that God is at work, and that over time we see the divine hand in our lives and in our churches and in our children. And so even as I move against what I'm calling dogmatism, I very much want to hold on to the possibility or the reality of assurance that we do receive from the Holy Spirit, that God is with us, that God loves us, and that the way of Jesus is the way of truth and the way of life, and the way of joy. So that section is just a little bit about the land of dogmatism as the first extreme that I think we need to move away from in the church if we're going to speak a word of good news to ourselves and to our culture. And so the second extreme, on the other side of the pendulum or the other side of the spectrum, is what I'm calling the land of doubt. And this has become popularized by any number of sort of Barna surveys or statistics that tell us people are increasingly walking away from religious faith. Some of those statistics are probably well researched and well presented, and as you all know, some statistics are not, and it can be difficult sometimes to sort through the different statistics. But if one segment of the church, I think, has kind of idolized a form of certitude that's different from faith, then another segment of the church, on the more progressive side, often has valorized doubt. And so it's this dichotomy. On one side, doubt is demonized, and on the other side, doubt is valorized. And if you don't doubt, then you must not be smart, or you must not be paying attention, or you must be a sheep, who's been brainwashed. And so doubt is almost held up as a virtue. And what I find interesting is that in the New Testament often speaks against doubt. Jesus speaks against doubt. And so what I try to do in this section of the book is to examine some of these anti-doubt passages and try to figure out what's going on there. Many of us know we've been through sort of dark nights of the soul. We've been through trauma and loss and abuse and questions that you don't always choose when you are going to be ambushed by uncertainty. You don't always get to choose when you will begin to have questions about your faith. It's not like you just dispassionately walk up to the buffet line of life and say, I'll take the fruit casserole and I'll take the tuna salad, and then also a side of soul-crushing doubt or something. Our doubts ambush us after the loss of a child or a spouse or a parent, or after trauma. And when Jesus speaks against doubt, I don't see him speaking against what you could define as honest questions. I don't think that oftentimes is what the New Testament has in view when we see it translated in the English, doubt. And so what is Jesus talking about, and what are other New Testament passages talking about? And I kind of lean on some biblical scholars, some friends of mine, and some other people who've done really good work here to say that oftentimes when we see that word doubt, what we are dealing with is what could be sort of literally translated as the divided soul or the divided heart, which is not so much the presence of questions, but rather a division of loyalty, or to quote my friend Matthew Bates, divided allegiance, where we want to divide our allegiance between Jesus, but also ourselves, or Jesus, or also sort of the cultural sort of norms and what are deemed to be cool or acceptable in our own day. And oftentimes that doubt word is not so much about the people who have honest questions, but people who have divided loyalties. And that's a very different thing. Matthew Bates, New Testament scholar, who I really appreciate a lot, he says that faith, pistis in the Greek, is not about being certain. He says it's about being certain enough to yield to King Jesus and to follow him even in the presence of your doubts or your uncertainties. And we think of, the father who Jesus, comes to Jesus with his child is in trouble, and Jesus says all things are possible for him who believes. And the man says, I do believe, but help my unbelief. And that's a position that many of us can relate to, because it's as if faith and doubt exist together in the same head alongside of each other sometimes. And what does Jesus say to this dad? He doesn't say, sorry, you got to be 100%. No, he works with that kernel of trust or belief or allegiance. And he brings this man into a place of assurance by virtue of his miraculous work. And so doubt, this region of deconstruction, when I talk about it, it's more about divided loyalties. And then additionally, I think sometimes it is about a decision to just sit on the fence eternally so that you don't have to go all in for Jesus. And so, yes, it's about divided allegiances, but yes, it's also sometimes a desire to fence sit eternally. And I talk about this through the analogy of even like some of my college students. Some of us can remember college and you don't know what you want to do when you grow up, and you don't want what major you want to do, and you end up changing your major. Every semester you have a new major. And that process can be helpful to sort through and to have a change of mind even. But if you just continually never arrive at a place of commitment, it's almost certain that you won't be fulfilled or happy or ever out of debt. Commitment is almost a prerequisite to assurance. We can't sit on the fence eternally. And I think that's the second aspect of doubt that many people wrestle with. Sometimes we wrestle with it because we know to commit means that we'll have to change. We'll have to change our behaviors. We'll have to change our priorities. We'll have to change how we spend our money and how we spend our time. And so there's an aspect of this desire to sit on the fence that I think Jesus in the New Testament and the scriptures, all of the scriptures, choose you this day who you will serve. That's a call to commit, and then to trust that God will work after that commitment. And so the first region is the land of dogmatism. The second is the land of doubt, the divided soul. I do some stuff there that's interesting, I think, with regard to science and regard to split brain experiments. I don't necessarily want to get into all of that right now, but we have questions like how we can almost seem like we have two different sets of beliefs sometimes within our own consciousness. And there's even some physiological and some scientific things that I think are interesting there. But none of them preclude the possibility of saying yes to Jesus with an attitude of allegiance in spite of our ongoing questions. And so that's the land of dogmatism, and then the land of doubt. And the book ends with 3 case studies in what I call practicing perhaps. And earlier in the book, I look at some historical examples of Christians who had a kind of active imagination that helped them, but also sometimes hurt them in their faith. I spend some time looking at one of the most famous or infamous speculators of the Christian tradition, a guy by the name of Origen of Alexandria, from the early church, who did some really helpful things in some ways in sort of pioneering the doctrine of the Trinity and loving Scripture deeply, but also going on some flights of fancy or speculation that were probably problematic. So Origen, I look at a female mystic by the name of Julian of Norwich, who is a fascinating woman in what we would call England today, who was the first woman that we know of to write a book in English. And her reflections on this vision of Christ as he came to her on her deathbed. And she tried to sort through, what does this vision mean that profoundly changed her? And yet she didn't fully understand it. I look at what's the place of these sort of mystical or spiritual experiences in faith and theology. And then thirdly, I look at I would say American, but he's really North American before the founding of America, Jonathan Edwards, great, American theologian. I would have some massive differences with him on some more Calvinistic leanings about divine sovereignty and things like that, but also an incredibly speculative and radical theologian in some ways that I think were problematic, but in other ways that were really helpful in the search for what I call non-contrastive solutions to certain problems. And Edwards did that with his ability to hold together God's desire for glory, to be glorified, and our human desire for fulfillment or happiness. And Edwards' claim is that actually, no, those two things actually come together, because we as human beings find our ultimate satisfaction and fulfillment when we glorify God with our lives. And it's a really creative, non-contrastive way of thinking. So I have those historical exemplars that I look at as kind of people who tried to have a kind of redeemed Christian imagination. And then in the end of the book, I do 3 case studies on just questions in theology. The first one, the name of the chapter is Dead Animals. And I look at a question that Charles Darwin had that really haunted his faith. And the question, believe it or not, was not so much about human suffering. Darwin thought that, well, I could kind of see a purpose for human suffering. We grow from it, and there's certain good results perhaps, but the thing that really haunted him, as he initially was a very devout Christian and then began to doubt his faith later, it had to do with the suffering of animals. And he's like, why in the world would a benevolent, loving creator would allow just millions and millions of lower creatures to suffer for no apparent reason? So I look at that question, which is not a question the scriptures just directly address. There's not a passage that says, here's how you should think about animal suffering, and try to apply a faithful, orthodox Christian imagination to that question. And then the second case study is about one of the most difficult passages that exists for Wesleyans especially, and that is Romans chapter 9 and Paul's treatment of vessels of wrath. What do you do with that passage? And one of the things I've found really fascinating is that Paul frames Romans 9:22 as a what if style question. And this is a book, the title is Perhaps. Paul says, what if God, although desiring to, and it's that famous sentence there that leads into the vessels of wrath, and has different translations, the causal, the concessive, that's a big kind of can of worms. It's fascinating to me that it's a what if question that Paul never actually answers. He never concludes with an answer. And so I try to wrestle with, well, what does that mean for a God who is the potter and shapes humans, but not in such a way, I would argue, as to make us sort of destined for destruction in some sort of predestinarian way. And so I wrestle with Romans 9. And then lastly, the last case study has to do with one of my favorite Christian fiction books, The Great Divorce, and questions of last things, and Lewis's imagination. I'm not so much trying to render a verdict on whether or not Lewis was correct, in his kind of fictional work there, The Great Divorce, but I'm trying to say that there's something important about the ability to write good Christian fiction that opens up imaginations to the gospel, so that people can see the beauty of our faith as well as the truth value. And that's something that I think Lewis did really beautifully in that book and in others. But I think because time's getting short, I want to do some questions. I've been rambling to my own image, to my own face long enough. But my real exemplar in this book is not Julian of Norwich. It's not Origen of Alexandria. It's not Jonathan Edwards or anybody else. It's Abraham, Father Abraham. And in Genesis 22, we have one of the most frightening and yet powerful stories in the Old Testament where God asks Abraham to sacrifice his one and only son. The son, through whom Abraham has been promised descendants like the stars. And man, if you have an incident that would raise questions or doubts, that certainly seems like it. And the question I asked was, how is Abraham willing to obey this God, even in the aftermath of such a terrible, baffling command? And we don't really get an answer, I don't think, in Genesis. But we do get a hint in the book of Hebrews, because Abraham is listed in the Hall of Fame there. And the writer of Hebrews says that Abraham believed, or rather he reasoned, or he considered, logisomenos in the Greek, he considered, or he reasoned, or in the Southern translation, he reckoned that God could even raise the dead. And so his baffling obedience was rooted in a belief in resurrection. And I think that's the same thing it's rooted in for us. I just got word today that one of my good friends at church passed away. We are people who face daily the reality of death with the hope of resurrection. You could ask, well, why in the world would Abraham, this ancient man, believe that this God could raise the dead? And yet, in two different instances in the Genesis story, we see Abraham watching this God bring life from death. Sarah's womb was as good as dead. Abraham's body, it says, was as good as dead. And yet here's this little kid. And so his obedience is enabled, not just with blind leap in the dark, sort of Kierkegaard trust or hope or anything like that, but because he can look back in his story and see moments where this God has proven faithful. And that can help him just take the next step of obedience up that mountainside, even when it doesn't seem to make sense. And so I've found that story incredibly helpful for me in my own life when I have questions, to take that next step of faith and to land in that dangerous middle ground between doubt and dogmatism. But in the place where I feel like God wants me to be, so that I can minister to people who have questions and who maybe don't fit easily in either one of those camps. And so I think with that, I want to say thanks for letting me talk, and I want to leave the rest of the time for just a few questions if anybody had some of those, if anybody's still there.
They are. Thank you for your thought-provoking presentation, Josh. That was wonderful. Thank you so much. I do have a few questions that have come through already through the chat. First question is, Josh, you mentioned bridging the gap between the academy and the local church. What do you see as the biggest issue that creates this divide or this gap?
Mm-hmm. In many cases, I think it's just language is such a big, the fact that we sometimes seem to be speaking different languages. And I've noticed that when I've written an academic book, I wrote an academic book on the doctrine of atonement called The Mosaic of Atonement. And all my academic friends said, man, this is so accessible. I feel like I could just hand this to my pastor or somebody in my church and it's accessible, And then when I had actual pastors or lay people try to read it, their response was, I don't know what you're talking about. And so it was like this, the academy thought, wow, what a great popular level book. And then the lay people and the pastors thought, I don't know what you're talking about. And so I've just written another book that's coming out in March called How Jesus Saves. And it's also on the atonement. But the thing I worked really, really hard to do is to say, I want this to be understandable. It's not that lay people are unintelligent. I mean, they're every bit as intelligent as a theologian or a biblical scholar. They're just their expertise is in different fields. And we often underestimate the extent to which I think we're talking different languages. And And then I think the second area where the gap exists is we really have to make an effort in the academy to say why this matters for your life, for your family, for your kids, for your marriage, for your finances, for your own soul, to communicate that this does matter. And it's not just sort of irrelevant, hypothetical speculation or something like that. So maybe those two things, the issue of language and the issue of application, would be two big ones.
Okay, thank you. Second question I've got here is, did you notice an expansion of the space between doubt and dogmatism during COVID?
Yes.
Was it born out of that, I guess?
I think it was already there previously. The trends were already there, even if you want to look at kind of survey data and things like that. The culture was already polarized. There were already divides, but COVID just took everything and amplified it. That happened politically, it happened socially, it happened racially, it happened even in the divide between the academy and the church. I think anxiety tends to amplify, and I think when you're anxious, you're stuck at home, you're out of work, you're not sure if you're, so the short answer is yes. I think most pastors would say that's fairly non-controversial.
Okay. Is that what led you to write the book? Was it during that time, or was it?
No, books, especially academic books, at least for me, take a long time. And that's one of the things that I'm always kind of, it really takes, it probably took me maybe 2 years to write the book. And then there's another year typically between when maybe you submit the manuscript to a publisher like IVP or Zondervan, and then when it actually comes out. And so the book was something that had been written, or was mostly written before COVID, but it certainly seemed more relevant or apropos in the wake of a lot of the events that transpired with COVID. Yeah.
All right, another question from a pastor here. He says, I noticed when you said the pastor wrote the note to yell louder in his script. How do we fight that urge when it's something especially that we believe in deeply?
Yeah, I had another friend say that sometimes he notices that people tend to yell louder when they feel like they're losing an argument. And I certainly am guilty of that. And the problem is, I think it only exacerbates the losing. And so I think that one of the ways that we can maybe counteract that, because I'm a passionate person as well, is that we have to have a proper sense of God's sovereignty over history. That as much as I might have kind of an inflated ego, like my ability to pound this argument home is really not what is ultimately determinative of the future. And the angrier I get, the more I lose the argument, and the more I I talk about in the book what I call the Elijah Heresy, which is basically this sense that everyone has abandoned the faith and I alone am left as a prophet of the Lord. And God often has, as he did with the prophets, first of all, sit down, take a nap, eat something. And by the way, you're not alone. And that's something that's relevant, not just for Old Testament prophets, but for millennial preachers like myself, as we get sometimes frustrated with trends in our churches or in our schools or in our world.
Amen. Well, Dr. Josh, I can't thank you enough for your time today. Thank you so much for your presentation and for carving out some time for us. And thank you to those who are watching now and those who will be watching the recording. As we said, our goal to do these webinars is to be a resource to the local church. So we hope that you find this information helpful. If you have any additional questions that were not submitted during the live presentation, you can email those to me at joel.hunt@endwest.edu. I'll forward those to Dr. Josh, and we'll see if we can get those questions answered for you. We also want to thank Wesley Seminary for sponsoring today's event. If you have questions, you're thinking about seminary, call us 877-673-0009. Thank you for watching. Have a great rest of your day. And remember, we are Wesley and you belong here. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. McNall.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.